I stepped into the Aspen auction room while my family snickered, treating me like a poor stray who had wandered into a palace. They were certain my sister would wear the crown today, oblivious that the bank had approved my credit limit higher than anyone else in the room. When the gavel finally struck, the $15 million Montclair Summit estate belonged to me. In that second, the last shred of power they held over my life simply vanished. My name is Elise Barnes, and as I stepped out of the battered charcoal gray rental SUV, my boots sank into the pristine gravel with a wet, ugly crunch that seemed to echo across the parking lot. The vehicle was a 10-year-old model I had rented from a budget lot near the airport, and it sat there shuddering slightly as the engine cooled, looking like a dirty bruise amidst a sea of gleaming white Range Rovers and black Bentleys. The air in Aspen was thin and sharp, smelling of pine needles and that specific, crisp scent of money that seems to permeate everything in this town. I pulled my scarf tighter, a knitted black wool thing that had seen better days, and forced myself to lock the car door with a manual key. I could feel the eyes on me immediately. This was not a public auction for foreclosed homes. This was the Montclair Summit Estate event, a gathering that required a six-figure deposit. Just to get a paddle, to the valet parkers and the women in fur coats standing by the entrance, I looked like a staff member who had arrived late, or perhaps a lost tourist who had taken a wrong turn off the highway. Then I saw them. They were standing near the massive double oak doors of the auction house, arranged perfectly as if waiting for a photographer to snap a candid shot for a lifestyle magazine. My family, my father, Greg, was wearing a camel hair coat that I knew cost more than my first car. My mother, Lydia, was draped in a silver fox fur that caught the winter light, her makeup flawless, her posture rigid with practiced elegance, and in the center, radiating that blinding golden energy she had perfected since kindergarten, was my sister, Savannah. Savannah was the first to spot me. Of course she was. She had a radar for anything that might ruin her aesthetic. She nudged our mother, whispered something, and then turned fully toward me, her face breaking into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile made of sharks and sugar. "Oh, look!" Savannah's voice carried effortlessly over the low hum of the crowd. It was a trained voice, modulated for social dominance. "Elise is here. Did you get lost looking for a discount outlet? Sweetie, the thrift store is 3 blocks down, past the uncivilized part of town." The group of wealthy strangers surrounding them erupted into polite, sharp laughter. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't about humor. It was about exclusion. It was a signal that they belonged, and I did not. My parents didn't hush her. They didn't look embarrassed. Instead, Greg let out a booming chuckle, clapping a hand on the shoulder of the man next to him. "That is my oldest," my father announced, his voice booming with performative exasperation. "Always marching to the beat of a very cheap drum. We love her, but she does have a knack for showing up where she is least expected, usually dressed for a hiking trip gone wrong." Lydia chimed in, smoothing the front of her coat. "Just ignore her, everyone. She probably just wants to see what the inside of a real building looks like." 10 years ago, that moment would have ended me. I would have felt the heat rising in my cheeks, the stinging of tears in the corners of my eyes. I would have stuttered an apology, turned around, and driven that terrible rental car until I ran out of gas. I would have let their shame become my shame, digesting their insults like poison until it made me sick. But standing there in the freezing Aspen wind, with the temperature hovering around 10 degrees, I felt absolutely nothing. My pulse remained steady at 60 beats per minute. My breathing was rhythmic and deep. I looked at Savannah, at her perfect teeth and her cruel eyes, and I didn't see a monster anymore. I just saw a variable in an equation I had already solved. Their laughter was just audio data, irrelevant noise in a system I was about to dismantle. I didn't say a word. I didn't frown. I didn't look down at my boots. I simply walked past them. As I brushed by Savannah, she leaned in. Her perfume, a heavy floral scent that reminded me of funerals, clogging my nose. "Don't embarrass us in there," she hissed, her public mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Stay in the back. Keep your mouth shut, and maybe Dad will give you gas money for the ride home." I kept walking. The heavy oak doors swung open, and I stepped from the biting cold into the warm, hushed atmosphere of the auction house foyer. The interior was a cathedral of wealth. The ceiling soared 30 feet high, supported by timber beams that looked like they had been hewn from ancient forests. A massive crystal chandelier, easily 8 feet across, suspended light that fractured against the polished stone floors. The room smelled of old leather, beeswax, and the terrifying silence of serious capital. I approached the registration desk. The woman behind the counter was young, with severe glasses and a blazer that looked sharper than a knife. She glanced up at me, her eyes flicking over my worn wool coat, my windblown hair, and the lack of jewelry. Her expression was the professional equivalent of a closed sign. "Deliveries are around the back," she said, not even looking at her computer screen. "This entrance is for registered bidders only." "I am a registered bidder," I said. My voice was calm, flat, and devoid of any apology. "Name is Barnes, Elise Barnes." The woman sighed, a small puff of air through her nose that signaled her annoyance at having to humor me. She typed my name into her terminal with aggressive, loud keystrokes, clearly expecting the system to return an error or a blank page. Then her fingers stopped. I watched the reflection of the screen in her glasses. The blue light washed over her face, and her eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. She blinked once, twice. She leaned closer to the monitor, her mouth parting slightly. The dismissive boredom vanished, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She looked up at me again, and this time, she didn't see the old coat. She saw the data. "Ms. Barnes," she stammered, her voice jumping an octave. She cleared her throat, frantically smoothing a stack of papers on her desk. "My sincerest apologies. I didn't realize. Please, forgive the assumption." She began typing rapidly, her demeanor shifting to efficient deference. She pulled a heavy cream-colored envelope from a locked drawer and slid it across the marble counter with both hands, as if offering an artifact to a deity. "We have your portfolio verified and your funds are fully liquid," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, though the trembling in her hands betrayed her awe. "You are approved for the full auction bracket, up to the highest ceiling. The house has waived the standard deposit hold based on the guarantee letter from your trust." The highest ceiling. The words hung in the air between us. It meant I had no cap. It meant that while the other people in this room were playing with limits, counting their millions and worrying about liquidity, I was walking in with the financial equivalent of a nuclear warhead. I reached out and took the envelope. Inside was a sleek black paddle with silver numbering. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than plastic should feel. It felt like a gavel. It felt like a weapon. Behind me, the heavy doors opened again, and the laughter of my family spilled into the foyer. They were still riding the high of their parking lot performance, high on their own cruelty. "I still can't believe she actually came inside," I heard Greg say, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I hope she doesn't try to order a drink. I am not covering her tab." The receptionist looked at me, then looked over my shoulder at my family. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with a question she didn't dare ask. She saw the name match, Barnes and Barnes, but the financial discrepancy on her screen was likely causing a cognitive short-circuit. I placed the paddle on the counter for a brief second to sign the final release form. The number on the paddle was 007. "Thank you," I said to the receptionist. "I prefer to remain anonymous to the general floor. Please ensure my bid designation is private." "Of course, Ms. Barnes," she whispered. "Absolute discretion." As I turned to leave the desk, I saw my family approach. They stopped dead. They saw the receptionist bowing her head slightly to me. They saw the black VIP paddle in my hand, a different color than the standard white ones they were currently queuing up to receive. The laughter died in their throats. Savannah frowned, tilting her head like a dog hearing a high-pitched whistle. Greg's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process the visual data that didn't match his worldview. Lydia just stared at the paddle in my hand, blinking rapidly. For a second, the air in the foyer changed. It went from the warm, confident atmosphere of their domain to something colder, something unstable. They felt a shift in gravity, a tremor in the ground beneath their feet, but they were too arrogant to understand what caused it. They assumed it was a mistake, a mix-up, a prank. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't offer a smirk. I didn't give them the satisfaction of engagement. I walked past them toward the double doors of the main auction hall, my boots clicking rhythmically on the stone. As I passed a large, gilded mirror near the entrance, I caught my reflection. I looked tired. My skin was pale from the winter months spent in server rooms and fluorescent-lit offices. My sweater was fraying at the cuffs, but the eyes looking back at me were not the eyes of the girl who used to beg for approval. They were the eyes of a predator who had spent 10 years learning how to hunt in the dark. I whispered to the reflection, to the audience that I knew was watching this story unfold. "They think they are the main characters," I murmured softly. "They have no idea that the script was rewritten 5 years ago." I pushed open the doors to the main hall and walked to the very back row. I found a seat in the shadows, away from the crystal lights and the velvet ropes. I sat down and placed the black paddle on my lap. In 45 minutes, the auction for the Montclair Summit estate would begin. In 60 minutes, the deed would be mine. My family believed with every fiber of their being that they were walking out of here with the keys to their new kingdom. But to understand why I was about to burn their dream to the ground with a single raise of my hand, you have to understand where the fire started. You have to understand that before I was the woman with the black paddle and the unlimited credit line, I was just a ghost in a house in Santa Fe. And ghosts, contrary to popular belief, have excellent memories. We lived in a stucco house on the edge of a mid-level suburb just outside Santa Fe, a place where the desert dust constantly tried to reclaim the manicured lawns. The house had a swimming pool in the backyard that was barely large enough to do a lap in, but from the right angle, if you cropped out the neighbor's fence, it looked like an infinity pool. That was the philosophy of the Barnes household. It did not matter what things were, only what they looked like in a photograph. My parents, Greg and Lydia, were curators of a life they could not actually afford. My father liked to tell anyone who would listen that he was a self-made man, a phrase that conveniently omitted the mountain of credit card debt and the second mortgage he took out to lease luxury cars. My mother was obsessed with the social hierarchy of our homeowners association. She treated neighborhood potlucks like diplomatic summits, strategizing over which casserole dish would convey the right mix of domestic warmth and upper-class detachment. In this carefully constructed diorama, my sister Savannah was the centerpiece. She was the golden child. Quite literally, she had hair the color of spun sugar and a smile that she had practiced in the mirror until it could disarm a traffic cop. She attended a private preparatory school that cost more than most people earned in a year, and she rode horses, not because she particularly loved animals, but because equestrianism was the kind of hobby that looked good on a college application and even better on Instagram. I was the error in their code. I did not have the blonde hair or the easy charm. I was quiet, dark-haired, and possessed an unsettling ability to sit still for hours, while Savannah was out at riding lessons or cheer practice. I was in my bedroom, surrounded by the carcasses of old electronics I had scavenged from the curb on trash day. I liked taking things apart. I liked seeing the green landscape of a circuit board, the logic of a soldering line, the absolute truth of a machine. A machine either worked or it did not. It never lied to you to make itself look better. My parents called my interests Elise's little tinkering. They treated my obsession with coding and robotics the way one might treat a child eating paste, a weird, embarrassing phase that I would hopefully grow out of before I had to be presented in public. I remember one afternoon vividly. I was 16. I had spent 3 weeks rebuilding a laser printer I found behind a law office. When I finally got it to print a test page, the hum of the motor felt like a symphony to me. I ran downstairs, ink staining my fingers, desperate to show someone that I had fixed something broken. I found them in the living room, Savannah was modeling a new riding jacket, a tailored navy blue thing with brass buttons. Greg and Lydia were beaming at her, their faces glowing with a pride so intense it was almost physical. "Look at the lines on that," my father said, nodding approvingly. "You look like a Kennedy, sweetheart." "I fixed the printer," I said, holding up the test page. My mother glanced at me, her eyes dropping instantly to my ink-stained hands. She didn't see the engineering. She saw the mess. "Elise, go wash up," she said, her voice tight. "You are going to get toner on the carpet, and please move that junk out of the hallway. Savannah has friends coming over, and we don't want the house looking like a repair shop." That was the dynamic. Savannah was the showroom. I was the utility closet. The most painful instances were the family portraits. Every December, we engaged in the ritual of the holiday card. We would drive out to a scenic location, a canyon ridge or a high-end resort lobby we weren't staying at, and coordinate our outfits. One year, when I was 17 and Savannah was 15, my mother bought Savannah a cream-colored cashmere dress that looked effortless and expensive. For me, she pulled a dark gray wool sweater out of the back of her closet. It was 2 sizes too big and smelled faintly of mothballs. "Neutral tones," Lydia declared. "We are going for earthy and sophisticated." We stood in front of a red rock formation, the photographer adjusting his tripod. Savannah stood front and center, radiating light. My father stood behind her, hand on her shoulder. My mother stood to the side, angling her body to look thinner. "Elise, honey," my mother said through her frozen smile, "you are casting a shadow on your sister's face. Step back a little." I took a step back. "A little more," the photographer instructed. "Maybe lean against the rock behind you. You are looking a bit stiff." "Just fade into the background, Elise," my father said, checking his watch. "Let Savannah catch the light. She is the focal point." I stepped back until the rough sandstone scraped against my spine. In the final printed card, I was barely in focus, a gray blur behind the glowing trio of the Barnes family. It looked artistic, people said. It looked like I was an afterthought. Dinner times were no different. The table conversation was a marketplace, and I had no currency. Savannah would recount her day, listing the compliments she received, the number of likes on her latest post, the boys who had asked for her number. My parents devoured these stories like starving people. They lived vicariously through her social capital. "I won the regional hackathon today," I said one evening, cutting into a steak that was slightly too tough. "I wrote a script that optimizes traffic light patterns. The judges said it could save the city thousands of dollars." The silence that followed was heavy. My father chewed slowly. My mother took a sip of her wine. "That is nice, Elise," my mother said finally. "But is it social? Did you meet anyone important?" "It is coding. Mom, it is about the data." "Well," my father grunted, "data does not feed anyone. You need to learn how to sell yourself. Elise, look at your sister. She got 300 interactions on a photo of a latte today. That is networking. That is the real world." "A traffic algorithm is the real world," I insisted, my voice trembling slightly. "It is how the world actually works." "It is a toy," Greg said dismissively. "It is a hobby for people who cannot handle people. Do not bank your future on staring at a screen, kiddo. Nobody pays attention to the wizard behind the curtain. They pay for the show." The final severance, the moment the invisible cord between us finally snapped, happened during the spring of my senior year. I had applied to universities in secret. I knew they would not help me with the applications, so I did them myself during my lunch breaks at school. When the large envelope arrived from a prestigious technical institute in California, my hands shook so hard I nearly dropped it. I had gotten in. Not only that, I had been awarded a partial scholarship. It covered 50% of the tuition. I needed my parents to co-sign a loan for the rest. It was an investment, a guarantee of a high-paying career in data science. I laid the letter out on the kitchen island that evening. I had prepared a spreadsheet. I showed the projected starting salary of a data analyst versus the cost of the loan. It was a logical, undeniable argument. Greg read the letter. He looked at the numbers. Then he slid the paper back across the granite countertop as if it were a bill he refused to pay. "We can't do it. Elise," he said. His tone wasn't apologetic. It was matter of fact. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You just leased a new Audi last month. We have the credit." "It is not about credit," Lydia interjected, walking into the room with a pile of brochures. "It is about allocation. Savannah has been accepted to that private arts college in Los Angeles, the one with the acting program." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That school costs $60,000 a year. Tuition alone." "It is an investment," my mother said, her eyes shining. "The alumni network is incredible. If she makes the right connections, she could be the face of a brand in 2 years. We have to put our resources where they will yield the highest return." "I have a scholarship," I argued, my voice rising. "I am covering half of it. I am studying science. Savannah wants to study, what, performance art?" "She has the factor. Elise," my father said, slamming his hand down on the table. "She has the spark. We have to fan the flame. We cannot afford 2 private tuitions, and frankly, we are betting on the horse that looks like a winner." I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the fear behind their arrogance. They were terrified of being ordinary, and they truly believed that Savannah's beauty was the only ticket out of mediocrity. My brain, my logic, my hard work, it was invisible to them because it wasn't shiny. Lydia sighed, reaching out to pat my hand, but I pulled it away. "Oh, stop looking so tragic," she said. "Community college is fine for what you do. You are just going to be typing on a computer anyway. No one donates to the kid sitting behind the screen. Elise, we have to invest in Savannah. She is the one who will have a future people actually want to watch." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. No one donates to the kid behind the screen. I stood up. I picked up my acceptance letter and my spreadsheet. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange coldness settled over me, a numbness that felt like armor. "Okay," I said. "Okay?" My father looked surprised. He had expected a fight. "Okay," I repeated. "I understand the logic. You are investing in the asset you value." I walked out of the kitchen and went upstairs to my room. I sat on my bed and looked at the half-assembled computer on my desk. I realized then that love in this house was not a right. It was a transaction, and I was bankrupt. That night, I made a decision. I would figure out how to pay for my life myself. I would build my own world, brick by brick, code by code. And when I made it, because I knew with absolute mathematical certainty that I would make it, they would never see a cent of it. They wanted a show? Fine, I would give them silence. They wanted to bet on the horse that looked like a winner? I would own the track. I packed my bag 3 months later, but really, I left them that night at the kitchen table. The Elise they knew, the one who wanted their approval, ceased to exist. In her place, something harder, colder, and infinitely more driven began to take shape. The breaking point was not a shout or a slap, it was a laugh. It happened at the annual Christmas party 2 weeks after my 20th birthday. Savannah was holding court in the living room, a glass of sparkling cider in her hand, recounting her first semester at art school. She was glowing, surrounded by aunts and uncles who hung on her every word about acting workshops and networking mixers. I was standing by the refreshment table, refilling a bowl of spinach dip, when my uncle asked about me. Savannah answered before I could open my mouth. She laughed, a light tinkling sound that cut through the room. She said that I was still playing with my computer games in my bedroom, and that she hoped I would eventually figure out that high scores did not pay the rent. She made a joke about my GPA being lower than the temperature outside, which was a lie, but it did not matter. The room exploded in laughter. My parents laughed the hardest. I stood there, holding the bowl of dip, and I felt my physical form dissolving. I was not Elise Barnes, the human being. I was a punchline in a sweater. I did not say a word. I put the bowl down. I walked out of the room, past the tree loaded with ornaments I was not allowed to touch because I might break the aesthetic, and I went upstairs. I did not sleep that night. I waited. I waited until the last guest had left and the house settled into the heavy silence of 3 in the morning. I pulled my old duffel bag from under the bed. I did not pack memories. I did not take the photo albums or the stuffed bear from my childhood. I packed utility, 3 pairs of jeans, 4 shirts, my heavy coat, my toothbrush, and most importantly, my laptop. It was a bulky, 5-year-old machine with a battery that died after 40 minutes. But it was the only thing I owned that could build a future. I checked my wallet. I had $312. It was money I had scraped together from fixing neighbors' Wi-Fi routers and setting up printers, hidden in a hollowed-out book on my shelf. I walked out the front door without looking back. I did not leave a note. Notes are for people who want to be found, or for people who want to explain themselves. I had nothing left to explain. I walked 4 miles to the Greyhound station in the biting cold. When I bought the one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon, the clerk looked at me with tired eyes and asked if I was sure. I had never been to Oregon. I only knew it from tech forums where people complained about the rain and bragged about the startup culture. It sounded like a place where you could disappear and work. I arrived in Portland 30 hours later. The city was gray, wet, and smelled of diesel and wet concrete. It was perfect. The first week was a blur of survival instincts I did not know I possessed. I found a room for rent on Craigslist. It was a basement in a house belonging to an elderly woman who smelled of cat litter and peppermint. The room was the size of a closet, with a single window that looked out at ground level onto a patch of mud. It was damp, and the carpet was stained with something I chose not to identify. It cost $400 a month. I paid half up front and promised the rest in 2 weeks. That left me with barely enough money for instant noodles and bus fare. I stopped being a person and became a machine. I needed input to generate output. I got a job at a coffee shop downtown, opening shift. My alarm went off at 3:30 in the morning. I spent 8 hours steaming milk and being yelled at by people who had not had their caffeine yet. My hands were constantly red from hot water and sanitizer. When my shift ended at noon, I walked 4 blocks to a discount grocery store where I worked stock until 8 at night. I spent those hours lifting heavy boxes of canned peaches and bags of dog food, my back screaming, my feet blistering in my cheap boots. But the real work began when I got back to the basement. From 9 at night until 1 in the morning, I sat on the floor with my laptop plugged into the wall, leeching off the landlady's spotty Wi-Fi. I scoured the internet for anything that would pay. I learned Python. I learned SQL. I learned how to scrape data from websites. My first breakthrough came 3 weeks in. I found a post on a freelance board from a graduate student who had messed up his research database and needed someone to clean up 50,000 lines of entry errors. He was offering $50. I bid on it. I told him I could do it in 2 hours. I wrote a script that identified the pattern of his errors and auto-corrected them. I ran it. It took 45 seconds to execute. I spent the next hour triple-checking the results manually to be sure. When I sent the file back, the payment notification hit my account almost instantly, but it was the message attached to it that made me stop breathing for a second. This is the cleanest code I have ever seen. You saved my thesis. Thank you. I stared at the screen in that dark, mildew-scented basement. $50. It was not enough to buy a new pair of shoes. It was barely enough for groceries. But it was the first time in my life someone had looked at what I created and saw value instead of a nuisance. I was not the girl ruining the photo. I was the person who saved the thesis. I was exhausted. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand. My body ached in places I did not know existed. I was eating peanut butter out of the jar for dinner, but as I lay on the lumpy mattress that night, listening to the rain hammer against the pavement outside my tiny window, I realized something profound. There are 2 kinds of tired. There is the tired of being used, of being dismissed, of having your soul slowly suffocated by people who refuse to see you. That is a heavy, hopeless tired. Then there is the tired of work, the tired of muscles used, of brain power expended, of fighting for your own survival. I was physically shattered, but my chest felt light. For the first time in 20 years, I could breathe. I would rather die of exhaustion in a damp basement in Portland than live another day suffocating in a luxury villa in Santa Fe. 2 months later, I saw the ad. It was buried on the third page of a local tech job board, sandwiched between ads for dog walkers and telemarketers. Vector Pulse Freight Systems, seeking data intern. Must like chaos. We are in a warehouse. Bring your own headphones. It did not ask for a GPA. It did not ask for a prestigious university degree. It asked for a link to a GitHub repository. I sent them the repository where I kept my little scripts, the traffic light optimizer, the database cleaner, a half-finished program for predicting weather patterns based on historical almanac data. They emailed me back 10 minutes later. Come in tomorrow at 10. Vector Pulse was located in the industrial district, in a renovated brick warehouse that still smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil. There was no receptionist. There was no lobby. You just walked up a metal staircase to the second floor and opened a fire door. The office was an open floor plan of absolute anarchy. There were 6 desks made of doors propped up on filing cabinets. Wires snaked across the floor like vines in a jungle. Whiteboards covered every inch of vertical wall space, covered in diagrams, equations, and takeout menus. A man was standing in the middle of the room, yelling into a headset while pacing back and forth. He was wearing a faded band t-shirt and jeans that had a hole in the knee. He had dark circles under his eyes and hair that looked like he had been pulling at it. He saw me, pointed to a chair, and held up one finger. This was Jonah Kessler, the founder. He finished his call, ripped the headset off, and looked at me. He did not look at my clothes. He did not look at my shoes. He looked at me with an intensity that was almost unsettling. You are the one who wrote the script for the traffic lights, he said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. He pulled up a chair and sat backward on it, facing me. He had my code up on his monitor. I ran it, he said. It is aggressive. You prioritize flow over safety margins by 0.4%. It reduces idle time by 12%, I countered, my voice steady. The safety margins were redundant because the braking distance calculation was based on wet asphalt, not dry. I added a variable for weather conditions. Jonah stared at me. A slow smile spread across his face. It was not the polite, shark-like smile of my sister. It was the grin of a mechanic who just found a wrench that fit the bolt. Where did you go to school? He asked. I froze. This was the moment. This was where I would be exposed as a fraud, a dropout, a girl with nothing but a high school diploma and a chip on her shoulder. I didn't finish, I said. I am self-taught. Jonah didn't blink. He didn't frown. He waved his hand dismissively. Good. Universities teach you how to write code that is pretty. I need code that works when the server is on fire. He spun his monitor around. On the screen was a mess of data. Thousands of shipping routes, truck locations, fuel costs, and delivery windows. It looked like static to the untrained eye. Tell me what you see, Jonah said. Don't tell me what the columns say. Tell me what the story is. I stepped closer. I let my eyes unfocus slightly, looking for the patterns. I saw the clusters of delays in the Midwest. I saw the fuel spikes correlating with certain routes. I saw the inefficiency bleeding out of the system like oil from a cracked engine. You are losing money on the return trips from Chicago, I said, pointing at the screen. The trucks are deadheading back empty because the scheduling algorithm is prioritizing speed over load maximization. You are burning 18% of your fuel budget moving air. The room went quiet. The other 2 developers in the room stopped typing and looked up. Jonah looked at the screen, then back at me. I have had MBAs sit in that chair and tell me we needed better marketing, he said softly. You are the first person to see the bleeding. He stood up and extended a hand. His palm was rough, his grip firm. We don't have a coffee machine, he said. If you want coffee, you make it yourself. You are not here to fetch lunch. You are here to fix the Chicago problem. Can you start now? I have a shift at the grocery store at 4, I said. Quit, Jonah said. I will pay you double whatever they are paying you, and I will give you a key to the office so you can work whenever you want. I looked at his hand. I looked at the chaotic, messy, beautiful office. For the first time in my life, I was not being asked to stand in the back. I was being asked to drive. "I can start now," I said. I walked out of that warehouse 6 hours later. It was raining again, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt electric. I had walked in as a desperate girl looking for an internship. I walked out as a junior analyst for Vector Pulse. I had a key in my pocket. And for the first time, I had the strange, terrifying realization that the way I saw the world, in numbers, in patterns, in hard truths, was not a defect. It was the most valuable thing I owned. My family had spent 20 years trying to train it out of me. Jonah Kessler had taken 5 minutes to hand me a weapon and point me at the target. Vector Pulse Freight Systems consisted of exactly 9 human beings and a server room that used to be a janitorial storage closet. The air conditioning in there was held together by duct tape and prayer, and the hum of the rack servers was loud enough to vibrate the fillings in your teeth if you stood too close. To most people, it was a fire hazard. To me, it was a sanctuary. For the first time in my life, I was in a room where intensity was not mistaken for social awkwardness. When I started talking about optimizing freight corridors using real-time meteorological data overlay, nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody told me to smile more. Nobody suggested I would be prettier if I talked less about bandwidth and more about brunch. They just leaned in. They asked questions. They challenged my math, not my existence. Jonah gave me access to the raw historical data of our largest client, a regional trucking conglomerate that was bleeding money on fuel costs in the Pacific Northwest. He did not give me instructions. He just gave me the login credentials and said, "Find the leak." I disappeared into the code for 3 weeks. I stopped seeing the trucks as vehicles. They became nodes in a living, breathing network. I built a prototype model that did not just look at distance, it scraped data from municipal road repair schedules, cross-referenced it with historical rain patterns from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and layered in the commuter train schedules that often caused bottlenecks at grade crossings during rush hour. I called it the Fluidity Engine. It was ugly. The interface was just a command line with blinking green text. It had zero graphical flair. My sister would have vomited if she saw it. On a Tuesday afternoon, I called the team over to my desk. My desk was a slab of plywood on 2 sawhorses. Jonah stood behind me, drinking lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. "Okay," I said, my voice raspy from lack of sleep. I ran the simulation against last quarter's actuals. The standard route taken by the fleet is in red. My algorithm's suggested route is in blue. I hit the enter key. On the main monitor, thousands of red lines snaked across the map of Oregon and Washington. Then, the blue lines appeared. They were weird. They took back roads to avoid school zones at 3 in the afternoon. They paused shipments for 20 minutes at depots to wait for storm fronts to pass, rather than driving into headwinds that reduced fuel efficiency. At the bottom of the screen, the total cost calculation tallied up. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the whirring of the fan on my laptop. "Is that accurate?" Jonah asked, his voice very quiet. "I checked it 4 times, I said. "The fuel savings are 25%. The delivery time is slower by an average of 12 minutes per load, but the cost per mile drops by nearly a quarter." Jonah leaned in until his nose was almost touching the screen. He traced the blue line with his finger. Then he straightened up and looked at me. There was no mockery in his eyes. There was only the kind of respect that you cannot buy, beg, or fake. "You just saved that company $4 million a year," he said. That afternoon, Jonah promoted me. I became the lead algorithm engineer. It came with a raise that allowed me to finally move out of the basement and into a studio apartment that had windows above ground level. But more importantly, he sat me down and slid a piece of paper across the desk. "Equity," he said. "Stock options. You are not just an employee. Elise, you are building the engine of this ship. You deserve to own a piece of it." I signed the paper without really understanding what it meant. I knew the percentage was significant, but at that moment, the numbers on the page were abstract. I did not care about the potential payout. I cared that my name was on the document as an owner. The next 2 years were a blur of caffeine and code. We grew. We moved from the warehouse to a slightly less terrible office in the Pearl District. We hired more engineers. I stopped counting the hours I worked. There were nights I slept in a sleeping bag under my desk because I was in the middle of a compile and I did not want to break my flow. I remember waking up one morning at 5, my cheek pressed against the rough carpet, smelling of stale pizza and ozone. I sat up, my back aching, my eyes burning, and I smiled. I was exhausted, yes, but it was a clean exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of a builder. Back in Santa Fe, I was always tired from holding up a mask, from trying to shrink myself to fit into a frame that was too small. That was a toxic fatigue. This was the fatigue of a marathon runner crossing a finish line. I was tired because I was using every ounce of my potential. Then came the call from Northbridge Transit Group. Northbridge was a titan in the industry. They were the kind of company that didn't just buy software. They bought the people who made it. They wanted Vector Pulse. They wanted the Fluidity engine. Negotiations took 6 months. I was kept out of the boardroom battles, which was fine by me. I stayed in the dark, refining the prediction models, making the system indispensable. One rainy Tuesday in November, Jonah called me out onto the balcony of our office. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the city lights of Portland into streaks of gray and gold. Jonah looked tired. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 months, but he was grinning. "They signed," he said. "Is it a good deal?" I asked, pulling my hoodie up against the damp wind. "It is a 9-figure deal, Elise," he said. I stared at him. The rain dripped off the end of his nose. 9 figures? I repeated. $120 million, he said. Cash and stock. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a spreadsheet. He pointed to a row highlighted in yellow. "This is you," he said. I looked at the number next to my name. I blinked. I wiped the rain from my eyes and looked again. The number did not change. It was a number with 7 digits, a number that started with an 8. 80 days ago, I had been worried about the price of eggs. Standing on that balcony, I was looking at a number that meant I never had to worry about the price of anything ever again. "We close in 2 weeks, Jonah said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Congratulations, partner." The day I signed the final sale documents, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity of it. I sat in a conference room with a view of the Willamette River, surrounded by lawyers in suits that cost more than my father's entire wardrobe. I held a Mont Blanc pen that weighed as much as a hammer. As the tip of the pen touched the paper, a memory flashed in my mind. I saw my father standing in our kitchen, dismissing my acceptance letter to the Tech Institute. I heard his voice, clear as a bell. "Nobody pays attention to the wizard behind the curtain. It is a toy. Elise." I looked at the check sitting on the table. That toy had just yielded a return on investment that my father could not calculate even if he had 1,000 years. I let out a short, sharp laugh. The lawyers looked at me, confused. They probably thought I was hysterical with relief. They didn't know I was laughing at the ghost of a man in New Mexico who thought he knew the value of everything but knew the value of nothing. I signed my name, Elise Barnes. The ink was black and permanent. When the wire transfer hit my account, I did not go to a dealership. I did not buy a penthouse. I did not book a first-class ticket to Paris. I did what I always did. I looked at the data. I transferred 90% of the windfall into a diversified portfolio of low-risk index funds and municipal bonds. I created a trust structure that made it nearly impossible to trace the wealth back to me personally without a court order. Then, I took the remaining 10% and incorporated a new company, Barnes Dynamics Lab. It was a boutique consultancy, just me and a few contractors. We focused on high-level data architecture for supply chains. It was unsexy work. It was invisible work. It was exactly what I wanted. I stayed in my rental apartment. I kept driving my used car until the transmission finally gave out, and then I rented the cheapest SUV available whenever I needed to travel. I continued to wear my black sweaters and my worn-out boots. To the outside world, and specifically to my family, nothing had changed. If they asked, which they rarely did, I told them I was doing freelance computer work. In their minds, I was scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, probably fixing laptops in a back room somewhere. I became an invisible millionaire. There is a specific kind of power in having a secret that big. When my mother would call me, once every few months, to complain about the cost of maintaining the pool or to brag about Savannah's latest audition, I would listen. I would make sympathetic noises about how expensive everything was. "It must be hard for you, dear," she would say, her voice dripping with faux pity. "Rent is so high these days. Maybe you should look into getting a roommate." "I am managing, Mom," I would say. "I am getting by." I was not lying. I was managing a portfolio that generated more interest in a month than my father earned in 2 years. I was getting by just fine. But I let them have their narrative. I let them believe I was the failure. I let them believe I was the cautionary tale. Because I knew that one day, the bill would come due for their arrogance, and when it did, I wanted to be the one holding the mortgage. I did not know then that the opportunity would come in the form of a $15 million estate in Aspen. But as I sat in my small apartment, eating takeout Thai food and watching the numbers in my brokerage account tick upward, I knew one thing for certain. I was ready. The weapon was forged. Now, I just had to wait for the war. It happened in Boise, Idaho, of all places. I was attending a summit on supply chain logistics and automation, the kind of event where the coffee is stale and the air conditioning is always set to Arctic. I was there representing Barnes Dynamics Lab, sitting in the back of a breakout session titled Barriers to Entry for Women in Technical Infrastructure. I usually avoided these panels. I preferred to let my work speak for itself. But that afternoon, I found myself listening to a group of graduate students and junior engineers sharing their experiences. They passed the microphone around, their voices shaking with a mix of frustration and resignation. One girl stood up. She looked about 20, wearing a blazer that was slightly too large, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She gripped the microphone with white knuckles. "I applied for a back-end developer role," she said, her voice quiet. During the interview, the hiring manager looked at my resume, then looked at me, and said I had a great vibe for social media. He told me that girls generally fit better in community management than in coding. He said the back-end environment was too isolated for someone like me. The room murmured in sympathy, but I felt a cold spike drive through my chest. It was not just empathy, it was a memory. I heard my mother's voice echoing from that kitchen in Santa Fe. "No one donates to the kid sitting behind the screen. Savannah is the one people want to watch." I looked at the girl. Her name tag said Maya. And I saw myself. I saw the wasted potential. I saw a mind capable of building bridges or designing algorithms being told to go paint its face and smile for an audience. I left the conference early. I needed air. On the flight back to Portland, I could not sleep. I had a notebook open on my tray table. I started sketching. I did not sketch code or data structures. I sketched a building. For years, I had been hoarding my wealth like a dragon sitting on gold, terrified that spending it would somehow reveal me to the world. But looking at that girl in Boise had unlocked something. I realized that hoarding money was useless if I did not use it to change the equation. I drew a space that was the opposite of the dark, windowless server rooms where I had spent my 20s. I drew a sanctuary, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows, flooded with natural light, a place with state-of-the-art fabrication labs, quiet reading rooms, and collaborative spaces that encouraged debate rather than silencing it. I wanted to build a fortress for the girls who were told they belonged in the background, a place where their brains were the currency, not their faces. I called it the Aurora Project in my notes, but a drawing is just a fantasy without a foundation. 2 days later, I was scrolling through an architectural brokerage feed, a guilty pleasure I had developed since my bank account crossed the 8-figure mark, when I saw it. It was an article titled "The Crown of Aspen. Elliot Serrano's final masterpiece hits the block." I stopped scrolling. Montclair Summit. I knew the name. Anyone who appreciated modern architecture knew the name. It was designed by Elliot Serrano, a recluse architect who believed that physical space directly dictated cognitive function. He had built Montclair Summit not as a vacation home, but as a machine for thinking. I clicked on the virtual tour. The estate was breathtaking. It sat on a ridge overlooking the roaring Fork Valley, a structure of steel, native stone, and vast sheets of glass that seemed to float above the snow. But it was the interior that grabbed me by the throat. There was a central atrium designed to capture the specific angle of the winter sun, illuminating the house without glare. There was a library with acoustic paneling engineered to create absolute silence, perfect for deep focus. There was a solar studio with a retractable glass ceiling, originally intended for sculpting, but in my eyes, it was the perfect laboratory for robotics prototyping. It was not a house. It was a brain made of stone and glass. It was the physical embodiment of everything I wanted the Aurora project to be. I read the details. The Serrano family was liquidating the asset. It was going to a sealed bid auction in Aspen in 3 weeks. The estimated value was between $12 and $14 million. For the first time since I signed the Vector Pulse deal, I felt a desire to possess something material. It was a visceral pull. I could see the desks in that atrium. I could see the servers humming in the climate-controlled lower level. I could see Maya, the girl from the conference, sitting in that library, writing code that would change the world, surrounded by mountains that reminded her how big she could be. I was ready to call my wealth management team at Ironcrest Capital to start the inquiry process. But then, the universe decided to test me. I had a contact in the private banking sector, a woman named Elena who handled high-net-worth liquidity assessments. We grabbed drinks occasionally in the Pearl District, mostly to talk about market trends. I met her that Friday for a quick coffee. "You will never guess who popped up on my radar this week," Elena said, stirring her oat milk latte. "You are from New Mexico originally, right? The Santa Fe area?" "Yes," I said, taking a sip of my black coffee. "Why?" "We just processed a frantic pre-approval request for a client from Santa Fe, a family named Barnes, Greg and Lydia Barnes, and their daughter, Savannah. I think she is some sort of minor influencer." I froze. The cup stopped halfway to my mouth. I set it down slowly, careful not to let the ceramic clink against the saucer. "What were they applying for?" I asked. My voice was calm, but my heart rate had just doubled. "A leverage package for an auction in Aspen," Elena said, rolling her eyes. "They are trying to buy the Montclair Summit estate." The world tilted on its axis. "They are leveraging everything," Elena continued, unaware that she was talking about my parents. "Second mortgages, business loans, liquidating retirement accounts. They are scraping the barrel to get to a $14 million limit. Apparently, the daughter, Savannah, wants to turn it into a content house. You know, a lifestyle headquarters for her brand. She wants to turn the main library into a yoga studio for streaming and use the atrium for fashion shoots." I felt a wave of nausea. It was not just the audacity, it was the desecration. Montclair Summit was designed for silence, for thought, for the elevation of the human mind, and my family wanted to buy it, gut its purpose, and turn it into a background for selling slimming teas and fast fashion. They wanted to take a cathedral of intellect and turn it into a funhouse mirror. "Do they have the money?" I asked. "Barely," Elena laughed. "They are overextended. If they win this, they will be eating ramen for the next 10 years to pay the interest. But they are convinced it is the investment that will launch Savannah into the A-list. They think this house is their ticket to royalty." I went home that night and pulled up the virtual tour of Montclair Summit again. I stared at the library. I imagined Savannah in there, dragging tripods across the slate floors, covering the acoustic panels with ring lights, talking into her phone about manifesting abundance while standing in a room built for studying the stars. I thought about Greg and Lydia, strutting through those halls, telling their friends they owned a Serrano masterpiece, using the architecture as a prop to prove they were better than their neighbors. They did not care about the light. They did not care about the acoustics. They only cared that it was expensive and that other people wanted it. It would be the ultimate tragedy, not just for the house, but for what the house could be. If I bought it, I would be stripping my anonymity. I would have to walk into that auction room. I would have to face them. I would have to reveal that the failure daughter was capable of buying and selling their entire existence. But if I did not buy it, if I stayed in the shadows, then the bad guys won. Not the villains in a movie, but the banal, hollow villains of vanity who believed that appearance was the only reality. If I did nothing, that library becomes a selfie station. If I did nothing, the girl in Boise never gets her sanctuary. I stood by the window of my apartment, looking out at the Portland rain. No, I whispered to the empty room. This was not about revenge. Revenge is petty. Revenge is slashing tires or throwing a drink. This was a rescue mission. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Ironcrest Capital. It was late, but when you have the kind of capital I had, nobody minds the time. This is Elise Barnes, I said when my account manager answered. I need to structure a purchase vehicle for a property acquisition, and I need a paddle for an auction in Aspen. Priority clearance. Of course, Ms. Barnes, the voice on the other end said, smooth and professional. What is the budget cap? I thought about the $14 million limit Elena had mentioned. I thought about my father's arrogance. I thought about the library. Set the limit at $20 million, I said, and make sure the entity is registered as the Aurora STEM Trust, but I will be bidding in person. I hung up the phone. My hands were not shaking. I was not going to Aspen to fight with my family. I was going to Aspen to save a piece of art from people who did not know how to read it. The fact that it would destroy their ego was just a bonus, a very satisfying, very expensive bonus. The seeds of Montclair Summit were planted that night. It was no longer just a building. It was the battleground where the old world of "look at me" would collide with the new world of "watch me build," and I intended to be the one left standing when the gavel came down. The war room was not a bunker. It was a glass-walled conference room in the corner of the Barnes Dynamics Lab office in Portland, overlooking the gray swell of the Willamette River. On the table between us sat a stack of documents thick enough to stop a bullet. Nora Hale, my CFO, sat opposite me. Nora was a woman who viewed emotions as inefficiencies in an otherwise perfect system. She was 60 years old, wore tailored suits that looked like armor, and had a mind that could dismantle a balance sheet faster than I could deconstruct a server. She did not care about my family drama. She cared about solvency. Walk me through the liquidity position again, I said, leaning over the spread of papers. Nora tapped a manicured fingernail on the top sheet. We have moved the primary capital into a short-term holding account with Ironcrest Capital. It is fully liquid. You have access to $20 million in immediate funds. No waiting periods, no wire delays. If you raise your paddle, the money is there before your arm comes back down. And the structure? I asked. We are not buying this as Elise Barnes, Nora said, sliding a leather binder toward me. We are buying it as the Aurora STEM Trust. It is a nonprofit foundation we registered 48 hours ago. The stated mission is to provide physical environments for advanced technological education for underrepresented groups. I opened the binder. The paperwork was flawless. By purchasing Montclair Summit through the trust, we were not just buying a vacation home. We were acquiring an educational facility. The tax implications were favorable. But more importantly, it created a legal fortress. If my family ever tried to sue me or claim I had acted out of malice, I could point to the charter. I was not a vindictive daughter. I was the president of a charitable organization making a strategic acquisition. The anonymity protocols are tight, Nora continued, her voice clipped and professional. Ironcrest has briefed the auction house. You will be assigned a bidder ID. To everyone else in that room, you are just a number and a credit rating. The auctioneer knows the funds are verified, but they do not know the source until the deed transfer is initiated. I nodded, feeling the cool logic of the plan settling my nerves. This was not a street fight. It was a surgical strike. Now, Nora said, her tone shifting slightly. She pulled a single sheet of paper from a separate folder. We need to talk about the competition. The auction house released the anonymized bidder tier list this morning. It is standard procedure for the top bracket to see who they are up against in terms of financial weight. I took the sheet. It was a list of random ID numbers, categorized by their verified credit ceilings. There were 6 serious contenders. Bidder 7 Alpha, verified up to 12 million. Bidder 9 Charlie, verified up to 15 million. Bidder 2 Bravo, verified up to 10 million. And then I saw it. Bidder 4 Echo, verified ceiling, $14.3 million. The number jumped out at me like a neon sign. It was specific. It was messy. It was the kind of number you get when you scrape together every single asset you own, liquidate your 401k, take out a second mortgage, and borrow against your business inventory. It was the absolute hard limit of a desperate portfolio. That is them, I said softly. Nora looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. You can't know that for sure. Elise, it is just a number. I know the shape of their desperation, I replied. Elena told me they were scraping the barrel. 14.3 is a weird number. It means they hit a wall. They don't have 14.5. They don't have 15. They have exactly 14.3. I ran my finger over the paper. My own limit was set at 20 million. I had a $5 million buffer over their absolute ruin. I did not need to hack their bank accounts. I did not need to spy on their emails. The math told the story. They were walking into a room believing they were the heavyweights, unaware that they were bringing a knife to a drone strike. So, Nora said, folding her hands, the strategy? We wait, I said. We let them bid. We let them feel good. We let them scare off the smaller fish. When the price hits 12 or 13 million, they will think they have won. They will start celebrating in their heads. They will be mentally decorating the living room. And then? And then, when they hit their ceiling, I said, I make one bid, just one. I don't drive the price up incrementally. I don't play ping pong. I drop the hammer. Nora was silent for a long moment. She studied my face, looking for cracks in my resolve. Elise, she said, her voice softer than usual, I have to ask you this as your CFO and as your friend. Are you sure this isn't just an expensive therapy session? If you want to hurt them, you could just buy their debt. You could ruin their credit. You could destroy them for a fraction of the cost of this estate. I stood up and walked to the window. The river below was churning, gray water rushing toward the ocean. If I wanted to hurt them, I said, keeping my back to her, I would just publish the truth about where their money comes from. I would expose the loans and the lies, but that would just make them victims. They would spin it. They would cry on camera. I turned back to face her. This isn't about hurting them. Nora, it is about the house. If they get Montclair Summit, they will gut it. They will turn a masterpiece of engineering into a backdrop for selling diet pills. They will take a place meant for expanding the mind and use it to shrink people's self-esteem. I placed my hand on the binder for the Aurora STEM Trust. I am not buying it to keep them out, I said firmly. I am buying it to let the girls in. The fact that my family has to lose for that to happen is just collateral damage. I am willing to live with that. Nora studied me for another second, then nodded. She opened the binder and uncapped her pen. Okay, she said, but we need a kill switch. We need a hard stop. Emotions get hot in an auction room. If the bidding goes past 20 million, we walk. We do not dip into the operational reserves of Barnes Dynamics. We do not leverage the company. Do we agree? We agree, I said. If it goes over 20 million, I walk away. I will not burn down my future to settle the past. Nora signed the authorization page. Then let's go buy a house. The next 48 hours were a blur of travel and logistics. I flew commercial to Denver, then rented a car for the drive up to Aspen. I did not want a private jet manifest with my name on it circulating at the local airport. I checked into a hotel down the valley, a respectable but unassuming lodge that was far enough away from the luxury resorts where my family would undoubtedly be staying. The night before the auction, I sat in my hotel room. It was dark, the only light coming from the fireplace and the blue glow of my laptop screen. Outside the sliding glass door, the snow was falling in heavy, silent flakes, burying the world in white. I had the virtual tour of Montclair Summit open on my screen again. I navigated to the solar studio. I zoomed in on the slate floors, the reinforced steel beams, the way the light would hit the workbenches at 10 in the morning. I tried to imagine Maya, the girl from the conference, sitting there. I tried to imagine a dozen other girls like her, girls who loved math, who loved physics, who loved the smell of solder and the logic of code, filling that room with their ideas. Then the image shifted. My mind betrayed me. I saw Savannah standing in the center of the room. She was wearing a white dress, holding a glass of champagne. She was laughing. Behind her, a camera crew was setting up lights, drilling holes into the pristine stone walls to hang backdrops. My father was in the corner, loudly telling a guest that he had conquered this mountain. My mother was rearranging the furniture, complaining that the industrial aesthetic was too cold, covering the genius of Elliot Serrano's design with plush, beige rugs. My stomach twisted. It was a physical revulsion. It wasn't hatred. It was the sickness of watching something beautiful being vandalized. I closed the laptop with a snap. I walked to the glass door and pressed my hand against the cold pane. My reflection stared back at me. I looked different than the girl who had run away to Portland 7 years ago. My face was thinner. My eyes were harder. I was no longer looking for permission to exist. Tomorrow, I would walk into that room. I would sit in the back. I would be the ghost they thought they had exorcised. I touched the glass, tracing the line of the falling snow. "You don't know who I am anymore," I whispered to the invisible figures of my family out there in the dark. "You think you are fighting a girl who wants an apology. You have no idea you are fighting a woman who has already calculated the cost of your obsolescence." I turned away from the window and went to bed. I needed to sleep. I needed to be sharp. Tomorrow, the numbers would become real. Tomorrow, for the first time in my life, I would not be the one waiting for a handout. I would be the one holding the gavel. The main auction hall of the Aspen Glorious Estate Gallery was designed to make you feel small, or perhaps to make you feel that your money was not quite enough. The ceiling was a vaulted expanse of dark timber, hung with 3 chandeliers that looked like frozen explosions of crystal. They cast a merciless diamond-hard light on the rows of velvet chairs and the polished black marble floor. I sat in the last row, my back pressed against the cool plaster of the wall. I had chosen the seat carefully. From here, I had a sniper's view of the entire room. I could see the curve of every spine, the nervous tapping of Italian leather shoes, and the subtle inclination of heads whispering secrets. Waiters in white jackets moved through the aisles like ghosts, their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet, offering sparkling water that probably cost more than my hourly wage back at the grocery store. The air smelled of expensive things, aged scotch, heavy floral perfumes, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Then, the doors at the front swung open. Savannah entered. It was a masterful entrance. I had to give her that. She was wearing a floor-length white coat that looked like it was made from the pelt of a mythical creature. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe ponytail that emphasized her cheekbones. She didn't walk. She glided. It was a walk she had practiced 1,000 times in our hallway. The walk of someone who believes the ground is lucky to be stepped on. Behind her, Greg and Lydia followed like royal guards. My father was beaming, his chest puffed out, radiating the kind of confidence that usually precedes a catastrophic fall. My mother was scanning the room, making eye contact with anyone who looked important, her smile fixed and predatory. The room shifted. I felt it. The other bidders, men in bespoke suits, women in couture, turned to look. They saw the white coat. They saw the arrogance. And collectively, they made a judgment. That is the winner. They assumed, based purely on the theater of their arrival, that the Barnes family had the deepest pockets in the room. They had no idea that Greg was likely sweating through his dress shirt, terrified that a credit check might bounce. They took their seats in the front row. Center. Savannah placed her paddle on her lap with delicate precision. It was number 4 Echo. The auctioneer took the podium. He was a man with a voice like oiled mahogany, smooth and rich. Behind him, a massive screen illuminated the room with high-definition drone footage of Montclair Summit. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here to bid on a piece of history, the Montclair Summit Estate, the final residential masterpiece of Elliott Serrano." The screen shifted to the interior. I saw the library. I saw the atrium. "A home designed not just for living, but for thinking," the auctioneer intoned. "Awarded the Pritzker distinction for residential innovation, a sanctuary of light and sound, offering the most spectacular views in the roaring Fork Valley." The room murmured appreciatively at the mention of the view. But I didn't see the view. I saw the layout of the server racks in the basement. I saw the potential for a robotics lab in the garage. While the auctioneer sold them a lifestyle, I was looking at a blueprint for the future. "We shall open the bidding," the auctioneer said, scanning the room. "At $8 million. It started slowly, like a heavy train gathering speed. $8 million. A paddle went up on the left. $8,500,000, the auctioneer called out. $9 million, came a voice from the center. $9,800,000. This was the warm-up. These were the early skirmishes. The people who had money but not money. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over my black paddle. Number 007. I felt my pulse in my neck, steady and slow. At $10 million, the air changed. The casual bidders dropped out, lowering their paddles and shaking their heads. Savannah raised her hand for the first time. $10,100,000, she said. Her voice was clear, projected perfectly for the room. 10,000,001, the auctioneer repeated, looking for 10.5. I saw Lydia lean over to Savannah. Her whisper was loud enough to carry 3 rows back. "It is yours, baby. Nobody is going to go past 14 for a house this far from the ski lifts." It was a tactic. She wanted the room to hear her confidence. She wanted them to think they had a ceiling of 20 million. 11 million, a man in a gray suit shouted from the right side. He looked like a hedge fund manager from Chicago. Savannah didn't hesitate. She didn't even look at him. She just raised the paddle again. 11,500,000. 12 million. A couple in the third row chimed in. They looked like New York old money. 12,000,005, Savannah countered instantly. The rhythm was intoxicating. It was a drumbeat of millions. Bam, bam, bam. I watched my sister. She was enjoying this. She was feeding on the attention. Every time she raised that paddle, she felt powerful. She felt like the main character. But I was watching Greg. From my angle, I could see the side of his face. A bead of sweat had trickled down from his temple and was resting on his collar. He was smiling, but his jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He was doing the mental math. They were getting close to the red line. At $13 million, the New York couple shook their heads and put their paddle down. It was down to Savannah and the Chicago hedge fund manager. 13,200,000, the man bid. Savannah looked at Greg. He gave a barely perceptible nod. 13,500,000, Savannah said. Her voice was slightly higher now. The ease was gone. The performance was cracking. 13,800,000, the man shot back. The room went quiet. This was serious money now. This was the price point where investment turned into obsession. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I glanced down. It was a text from Nora. "They are hitting the rev limiter. Heart rates are elevated. Stay cold." I looked at Savannah. She was biting her lower lip. It was a nervous tic she had since she was 5. She wanted this so badly. She wanted the victory lap. 13,900,000, Savannah said. The hedge fund manager paused. He looked at his partner. He looked at the screen. He calculated the renovation costs, the property taxes, the market volatility. He was a businessman, not a vanity project. He shook his head and lowered his paddle. The room let out a collective breath. "The bid is with the lady in white at 13,900,000, the auctioneer said, his voice dropping to a dramatic hush. "Do I hear 14? Silence. Savannah was beaming. She turned to Lydia and grabbed her hand. They were practically vibrating. They thought they had done it. They thought they had scraped by, right at the edge of their limit, and secured the crown. 14 million? The auctioneer asked one last time. Savannah, unable to help herself, raised her paddle one last time to round it off, a gesture of absolute dominance. 14 million even, she said. It was a mistake. It was pure ego. She wanted the round number. She wanted the headline. Savannah Barnes buys $14 million estate. She didn't know that 14.3 was their absolute ceiling. She had just eaten into her own safety margin for the sake of aesthetics. $14 million, the auctioneer called. Going once. My family was already celebrating. Greg was loosening his tie. Lydia was reaching for her phone, probably to post a story. Savannah was looking up at the chandelier, imagining herself swinging from it. Going twice, the auctioneer said, raising his gavel. I took a breath. I felt the weight of the black paddle in my hand. It felt like a sword. $15 million, I said. My voice was not loud. I did not shout. I spoke with the flat, calm authority of a person stating a fact, like reciting the value of pi. The silence that followed was instant and violent. It was as if I had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The auctioneer froze, his gavel hovering in midair. He looked up, squinting past the bright lights to the back row where I sat in the shadows. He saw the number on my paddle. 007, the unlimited tier. I have a bid of $15 million from the back of the room, he announced, his voice regaining its professional composure. In the front row, the reaction was visceral. Greg whipped his head around so fast I thought he would snap a vertebrae. Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. And Savannah? Savannah turned slowly. Her face, which had been a mask of triumph 3 seconds ago, was now a grotesque landscape of confusion and shock. She squinted, trying to see who had dared to speak, who had dared to interrupt her coronation. I sat perfectly still. I did not wave. I did not smile. I just held the paddle up, steady as a rock. They couldn't see my face clearly in the shadows, but they could see the silhouette. They could see the worn sweater. They could see the dark hair. The realization hit them like a physical wave. I saw Greg's eyes widen until they were white circles. I saw Savannah's mouth drop open, her perfect lipstick suddenly looking like a clown's makeup. They knew. They knew it was me. But their brains could not process the data. Elise? The failure? The computer girl? $15 million? It was a cognitive dissonance so strong it paralyzed them. $15 million, the auctioneer repeated, looking directly at Savannah. Do I hear 15.1? Savannah looked at Greg. Her eyes were pleading. She looked like a child who had dropped her ice cream. Fix it, Daddy. Buy it for me. Greg looked at me, then looked at the auctioneer. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His face turned a shade of gray I had never seen before. He knew the numbers. He knew he had 14.3. He knew he was dead in the water. He shook his head. It was a small, jerky movement, a surrender. Savannah let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She looked at her paddle, the tool of her power, and realized it was now just a piece of plastic. I lowered my paddle. I looked directly at them across the rows of velvet seats. I let them see me. I let them see that I was not shaking. I was not angry. I was simply deleting their ownership of the narrative. Going once, the auctioneer called. My mother grabbed Greg's arm, her fingernails digging into his coat. She was whispering frantically, but Greg wouldn't look at her. He was staring at me, seeing a stranger in his daughter's skin. Going twice, the auctioneer said. I didn't blink. Sold, the auctioneer shouted, and the gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. To bidder 007 for $15 million. The room erupted in polite applause, but in the front row, there was no clapping. There was only the stillness of a bomb site right after the explosion, before the dust settles and you realize exactly what has been destroyed. The administrative room was quiet, a stark contrast to the theater of the main hall. I sat across from the representative of the auction house and my contact from Ironcrest Capital. The signing process was efficient. There was no fanfare, no confetti cannon, just the scratching of a pen against heavy legal paper and the transfer of digital signatures. I authorized the release of the funds. $15 million left the holding account of the Aurora STEM Trust and became a tangible asset of stone and glass on a mountaintop. "Congratulations, Ms. Barnes," the Ironcrest agent said, handing me a thick folder containing the preliminary deed and the keys. "It is a remarkable property." "It is," I said, taking the keys. They were heavy, cold metal. They felt real in a way the money never had. I excused myself and walked out through the side exit. I needed air. The heating system inside was excellent, but I felt suffocated by the lingering scent of desperation and perfume. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the private terrace that wrapped around the back of the building. The cold hit me like a slap, sharp and cleansing. It was snowing harder now, the flakes drifting down in the floodlights like white ash. I stood near the railing, looking out at the darkened shape of the mountains. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs, trying to process the fact that I had actually done it. I owned Montclair Summit. The war was over. Then I heard the door crash open behind me. It wasn't the polite opening of a staff member. It was the violent shove of someone losing control. Heavy footsteps crunched rapidly on the decorative gravel. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was, but I turned anyway. My father, Greg, was leading the charge. His camel hair coat was unbuttoned, flying open in the wind. His face, usually composed in a mask of affable success, was red and distorted. Lydia was right behind him, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield, and Savannah brought up the rear, her white coat trailing in the snow, her face streaked with mascara tears. They stopped 3 feet from me. They looked like refugees from a glamorous disaster. "Elise!" Greg shouted. His voice cracked. It was the sound of a man who had lost his anchor. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" I stood my ground. I put my hands in my coat pockets, fingering the keys. "I just bought a house. Dad, I thought that was obvious." "You didn't buy a house," Greg roared, stepping closer, invading my personal space. "You sabotaged us. You knew we were bidding on this. You sat back there in the dark like a sniper, and you waited until we were exposed." "I participated in an open auction," I said calmly. "You destroyed her future." Greg pointed a shaking finger at Savannah. "Do you have any idea what this estate meant for the brand? We had sponsors lined up. Elise, we had a 6-part web series in development based on the renovation of the solar studio. We promised this location to investors. You just torched millions of dollars in potential revenue." I looked at him. I looked at the genuine agony in his eyes. He wasn't upset that I had spent $15 million. He wasn't asking how I had $15 million. He was upset that I had broken his toy. He was upset that the prop for his daughter's play was gone. "You treated the property like a film set," I said. "I treated it like an asset." Lydia pushed past Greg. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of confusion and betrayal that seemed entirely performative. "How could you?" she screamed. "Of all the houses in the world, Elise, why this one? Why did you have to come here and humiliate your sister? You could have bought a condo in Portland. You could have bought anything. Why did you have to steal her dream?" "Her dream?" I repeated. "Mom, Savannah has never read a book on architecture in her life. She doesn't know who Elliot Serrano is. She wanted a backdrop. That is not a dream. That is a location scout." Savannah stepped forward. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing black makeup across her cheek. She looked ferocious and pathetic all at once. "You are such a parasite," she spat. The venom in her voice was pure and distilled. "You think you are so special because you won a bidding war? You are nothing. Elise, you are a loser who got lucky." She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing. "Who is he?" she demanded. "Who is who?" I asked. "The guy," Savannah sneered. "The old man. The sugar daddy. There is no way you have $15 million. You drive a rental car. You wear clothes from a thrift store. You are clearly sleeping with some senile billionaire who gave you his credit card to play with. That is the only explanation." I stared at her. The accusation hung in the cold air. So absurd, so insulting, and yet so perfectly in character for them. They could not conceive of a world where I had value on my own. In their cosmology, money came from looks, from charm, or from proximity to power. It never came from work. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest, but I suppressed it. This was not funny. It was tragic. "Is that really what you think?" I asked softly. "It is the only thing that makes sense," Lydia cried out. "We know you, Elise. We know what you are capable of. You fix computers. You don't buy estates in Aspen." "We know you," the phrase echoed in my head. I took a step forward. The gravel crunched under my boots. They flinched, stepping back as if I were dangerous. "In the last 7 years," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, cutting through the wind. "Since the day I left the house with a backpack, have any of you, even once, asked me what I actually do for a living?" Silence. Greg blinked. Lydia looked away. Savannah scowled. "I mean it," I continued. "Did you ever ask the name of the company I worked for? Did you ever ask what my title was? Did you ever ask to see a single line of code I wrote?" "We knew you were working in IT," Greg mumbled, defensive now. "You said you were doing freelance stuff." "I said I was consulting," I corrected. "You heard what you wanted to hear. You heard unemployed. You heard struggling, because that fits the story you tell about me to make yourselves feel better." I pulled my hands out of my pockets. I didn't have any papers to show them. I didn't need papers. I had the truth. "I was the lead algorithm engineer for a startup called Vector Pulse," I said. "We built the logistical tracking systems that half the trucking companies in this country use today. 4 years ago, a conglomerate called Northbridge Transit Group bought us out." I watched their faces. The name Northbridge meant something to Greg. He read the financial news. He knew who they were. His eyes flickered with recognition, then denial. "Northbridge?" he stammered. That was a massive merger. That was in the Wall Street Journal." "Yes," I said. The acquisition price was 9 figures. My equity stake in the company was significant." I let the word hang there. Significant. "I didn't win the lottery, Savannah," I said, turning to my sister. "And I am not sleeping with anyone to pay my bills. I built a piece of software that saved the industry millions of dollars in fuel costs. I made my money by being smarter than the problems I was solving. I made it while you were learning how to pose for selfies." Lydia looked like she had been slapped. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was doing the math. She was realizing that the charity case daughter she had pitied for years could have bought and sold her entire social circle 10 times over. "But," Greg started, his voice weak, "if you have that kind of money, why didn't you say anything? Why let us think?" "Because I didn't want you to know," I interrupted. "Because I knew that if you knew, you would try to make it about you. You would have told everyone that you nurtured my genius. You would have asked for loans to fund Savannah's lifestyle. You would have drained me dry and called it family obligation." Greg flinched. He knew it was true. "And now," Lydia whispered, "you come here to do this? To humiliate us in public? Is that what this is? Revenge?" "I didn't buy Montclair Summit to hurt you," I said. "I bought it because you were going to ruin it." "Ruin it?" Savannah screeched. "I was going to make it famous." "You were going to turn it into a prop," I said. "That house was designed by a genius to be a place of thinking. I bought it to turn it into a research institute. It is going to be the headquarters for the Aurora STEM Trust. It is going to be full of girls who are smart and driven and who need a place to work where nobody tells them they should smile more." I looked at the 3 of them, standing there in the snow, shivering in their expensive coats. They looked incredibly small. The monsters of my childhood had shrunk. They weren't powerful titans who held the keys to my happiness. They were just three vain, insecure people who had bet their entire identity on being looked at and were terrified that nobody was watching anymore. "I am not going to sue you," I said. "I am not going to bankrupt you. Though looking at your bid limit, you might have already done that to yourselves. I am just going to ask you to get out of my driveway." "Elise," my mother said. Her voice changed. It softened. It took on that wheedling, manipulative tone she used when she wanted a discount at a store. "Elise, honey, wait, we can talk about this. If you are starting a foundation, well, family should be involved. Savannah could be the spokesperson. We could help you manage the image. We can fix this." It was breathtaking. Even now, faced with the absolute destruction of their worldview, she was trying to pivot. She was trying to find an angle to attach herself to the success. I laughed then, a short, cold sound that vanished into the wind. "There is nothing to fix, Mom," I said. "And Savannah will never set foot inside this house, not as a spokesperson, not as a guest." I turned my back on them. "You spent 20 years telling me I belonged in the background," I said over my shoulder. "You were right. The background is where the work gets done. It is where the money is made. You can keep the spotlight. I will keep the deed." "Elise!" Greg shouted one last time. "You can't just walk away. We are your family." I stopped for 1 second. I looked at the heavy brass key in my hand. "No," I said, speaking more to the night than to them. "You are just people I used to know." I walked toward the parking lot where my battered rental car was waiting. I didn't look back to see them standing there. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what they looked like. They looked like the past, and I was driving up the mountain, toward the future. 3 months after the gavel fell, the silence of Montclair Summit was gone. It had been replaced by a symphony of construction that sounded better to me than any concerto. From 6 in the morning until 6 at night, the estate vibrated with the whine of power drills, the rhythmic thud of hammers, and the shouting of contractors hauling lumber. The grand living room, where my parents had envisioned hosting cocktail parties to impress their Santa Fe circle, was being transformed. The velvet furniture was gone. In its place, we were installing tiered seating and a modular stage. It was becoming the lecture hall, the lower level, which Elliot Serrano had designed with perfect acoustic dampening, was no longer a wine cellar or a home cinema. It was becoming the Synapse Center, a space dedicated to robotics demonstrations and pitch presentations where voices needed to be heard without amplification. I walked the site every day, wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots, working alongside Mara Collins, the interior architect I had hired. Mara was brilliant. She understood that we were not trying to erase Serrano's work. We were trying to give it a brain. "We keep the stone," Mara said one Tuesday, running her hand over the rough-hewn wall of the atrium. "It grounds the space, but we replace the decorative lighting with circadian rhythm LED systems. If these girls are going to be coding for 12 hours straight, they need light that keeps their cortisol levels balanced." Liam Porter, the project manager, was a burly man who had initially been skeptical about turning a luxury mansion into a school, but watching the transformation had converted him. "The server cooling system is installed in the east wing," Liam reported, pointing to a blueprint spread out on a sawhorse. "We routed the exhaust to heat the greenhouse. It is efficient. We are not wasting a single joule of energy." It was exhilarating. We were building a lab, a library, and a home all at once. The solar studio was fitted with heavy-duty workbenches and fume hoods for chemical engineering prototypes. The library shelves were stripped of the decorative, leather-bound books that nobody ever read. We filled them with biographies of Marie Curie, Ada Lovelace, and Grace Hopper, alongside technical manuals on quantum computing and astrophysics. Then came the day of the first trial run. We were not fully open yet. The paint was still drying in the hallways, but I needed to see if the theory worked in practice. We partnered with a school district in rural Colorado to bus in 20 high school girls from underfunded communities. These were girls who had never seen a 3D printer in real life, let alone used one. I stood by the front doors as the bus rolled up the winding driveway. When the girls stepped off, they were quiet. They looked at the soaring glass walls of the house and the sweeping view of the valley, and I saw them shrink. They were intimidated. They looked like they were waiting for someone to tell them they were trespassing. It broke my heart because I knew exactly how that felt. "Welcome," I said, stepping forward. "My name is Elise. This is not a museum. You do not have to whisper, and you definitely do not have to wipe your feet." I led them into the main atrium. We had set up stations. There were virtual reality headsets, high-performance laptops loaded with professional-grade coding environments, and a table full of Arduino microcontrollers. For the first 10 minutes, they stood with their hands in their pockets. Then, a girl with purple streaks in her hair tentatively reached out and touched a robotic arm we had set up on the central table. "You can turn it on," I said softly. "The controller is right there." She picked up the remote. The arm whirred to life. She gasped. "Whoa," she whispered. That was the spark. Within 20 minutes, the room was chaotic in the best possible way. The intimidation vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated curiosity. I watched a pair of girls figuring out how to calibrate the resin printer. I heard another group debating the best syntax for a Python script. I stood in the corner, watching their eyes. They weren't looking at the view. They weren't looking at the architecture. They were looking at the screens, at the machines, at the possibilities. For the first time, they weren't being told they were bossy for taking charge or nerdy for liking the tech. They were just engineers in their natural habitat. A week later, the press caught wind of what was happening. A reporter from the American Ledger, a serious financial publication, asked for an interview. I agreed on the condition that we talked about the mission, not the drama. The headline ran on a Sunday. "From Vanity to Vision, Businesswoman Transforms $15 million Estate into Future Hub for Women in STEM." The article was fair. It described the house, the facilities, and the goal. It alluded to my past without being gossip. It mentioned that I had overcome a background where my technical skills were undervalued. A polite way of saying my family thought I was a waste of space. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My inbox, which I had expected to receive a few inquiries from local schools, was flooded. Hundreds of emails poured in from all over the country. I wanted to be a structural engineer. One email read, "But my guidance counselor told me I was too pretty for construction sites. I am in marketing now, and I hate it. Thank you for showing us what is possible." Another read, "My dad threw away my acceptance letter to MIT because he said girls don't need to move that far away. I am crying, reading about this house." I sat in the newly finished library, reading these messages until the sun went down. I cried with them. I realized that my story wasn't unique. There was an entire generation of women who had been steered away from their power, told to be small, told to be decorative. Montclair Summit wasn't just a building anymore. It was a signal fire. Then came the twist that changed the financial landscape of the project. I received a call from the director of the gargantuan Horizon Educational Endowment. They were one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the hemisphere. "Ms. Barnes," the director said, his voice crackling with energy, "we have been reading about the Aurora STEM Trust. We love the model, the immersive environment, the mentorship, the focus on tangible skills. It is exactly what we have been trying to build." "Thank you," I said. "We are just getting started." "We want to accelerate you," he said. "The board has authorized a proposal. We are willing to match fund your operating budget for the next 5 years, dollar for dollar. In exchange, we want you to create a playbook. We want to replicate the Montclair model in 3 other cities." I nearly dropped the phone. Match funding for 5 years meant stability. It meant we weren't just a flash in the pan. It meant I wouldn't have to burn through my personal fortune to keep the lights on. It meant legacy. "We accept," I said, my voice steady, though my hand was gripping the desk edge. While the world was beginning to embrace the Aurora project, my sister was trying to claw back the spotlight. Savannah had taken to social media, posting vague, black and white photos of herself looking out windows with captions like "betrayed by those closest to you" and money changes people, but it can't buy class. She was trying to spin a narrative where she was the victim of a cruel, vindictive sister. A year ago. That might have worked, but the algorithm is a fickle beast. The comments on her posts were not the sympathy she craved. People were linking the American Ledger article. They were commenting things like, "Wait, isn't your sister the one building that school for girls? And maybe you should support her instead of vague posting." The public interest had shifted. The drama of the auction was old news. The mission of the academy was the new story. Savannah was shouting into a void, her voice drowned out by the sound of progress. I accepted invitations to a few podcasts and industry panels, but I set a strict rule. No questions about my family. No questions about the auction price. I brought Liam or Mara with me. I brought students. It is not about me. I told a podcast host who tried to ask about my revenge motivation, "If you want to talk about revenge, talk to the girl in our robotics lab who just built a prosthetic hand for $50 because she was angry that medical devices are too expensive. That is the kind of energy we care about." I refused to be the Elise show. My family had worshipped the cult of personality, and look where it got them. I was building a cult of competency. On the afternoon the contract with the Horizon Endowment was finalized, I stepped out onto the main balcony of Montclair Summit. The sun was setting, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of violet and gold. The air was crisp and clean. Below me, in the driveway, a van was unloading a new shipment of servers. I could hear the faint sound of students laughing in the atrium. I thought about the girl who used to hide in her room in Santa Fe, soldering circuit boards in secret, terrified of taking up space. I thought about the fear I had felt leaving that house with $300 in my pocket. I had spent so much of my life begging to be seen by people who were determined to look right through me. I had thought that if I just worked harder, if I was just smarter, they would finally love me. I realize now how wrong I had been. You do not ask for vision from the blind. I looked out at the vast, beautiful world stretching before me. I didn't need my parents to be proud of me. I didn't need Savannah to understand me. I had found my people. I had found my purpose. When I stopped banging on the locked door of my past, the whole world had opened a window. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the thin mountain air. I wasn't just the owner of a $15 million estate. I was the architect of a new reality, and for the first time in my life, the view was perfect. The articles in the American Ledger did more than just fill my inbox with gratitude from strangers. They sent shockwaves through the quiet, judgmental cul-de-sacs of Santa Fe. For years, Greg and Lydia had controlled the narrative, painting me as the wayward, ungrateful daughter while Savannah was the shining star. But print media has a way of solidifying the truth. When the neighbors read that the failure daughter had purchased a $15 million estate to launch a national educational initiative, the questions started coming. I heard from a cousin that Greg could barely go to the country club anymore without someone asking, with feigned innocence, why his name was not mentioned on the board of directors for the new foundation. The facade was cracking. They could no longer hide the fact that they had bet on the wrong horse, and worse, that they had treated the winning horse like a mule. They showed up on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks before our official grand opening. I watched from the second-floor window of the library. They arrived in a rented SUV, not the flashy luxury car they usually leased. They walked up the driveway slowly. There was no strutting today. There were no white coats or loud proclamations. They looked smaller against the backdrop of the mountains. They looked like people coming to negotiate a surrender, disguised as a family visit. I did not meet them at the door. I had my assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, escort them to the strategy hall. This room used to be the formal dining room where my parents would have hosted vanity dinners. Now, it was a conference space lined with whiteboards. On the far wall, a large map of the United States was dotted with pins marking the locations of our first wave of scholarship recipients. Directly above the main table hung a framed print with our internal motto, "No one here has to apologize for being ambitious." When I walked in, they were already seated. Greg was drumming his fingers on the table. Lydia was staring at the map. Savannah was looking at her phone, refusing to make eye contact with the room. "Elise," Greg said. Standing up, he tried to smile, but it was tight, pulling at the corners of his eyes. This place, it is impressive, really. The photos online do not do it justice. Thank you, Greg, I said. I did not call him Dad. I sat at the head of the table, folding my hands over a thin manila folder. What brings you all the way to Aspen? I know the drive is long. Lydia leaned forward. She was wearing less jewelry than usual. It was a calculated move to look humble. We wanted to see you, honey, she said. We have been doing a lot of thinking since the auction. We realized that, well, things got heated. We said things we didn't mean. We were just so stressed. Stress makes people honest, not liars, I said calmly. Greg cleared his throat, waving a hand as if to brush away my comment. Look, Elise, we know we might have been a little harsh on you growing up. We pushed hard, maybe too hard, but we did it because we wanted you to be tough. And look at you now. You are a titan. In a way, our pressure made this possible. It was a masterclass in revisionist history. He was trying to take credit for my resilience, as if his neglect was a strategic parenting decision. We think it is time to put the past behind us, Greg continued, gaining momentum. With the grand opening coming up, the optics need to be right. It would look very good for the foundation if the Barnes family appeared united. We were thinking we could stand on stage with you. Savannah could even give a short speech about the importance of sisterhood. It would help soften her image after, the misunderstanding at the auction. There it was, the pivot. They were not here to apologize. They were here to attach themselves to the rocket ship before it left the atmosphere. They wanted the photo op. They wanted the redemption arc without doing the work. Savannah finally looked up. Her eyes were hard. It is the least you can do, she said, after you humiliated me in front of half of Aspen. I looked at them. I looked at the map on the wall, representing hundreds of girls who needed real support, not performative family dynamics. I have something to show you, I said. I opened the manila folder and slid a single document across the polished table. It was a deed of trust, attached to a loan acquisition form. Greg looked at it. He squinted. Then, his face went completely pale. The color drained out of him so fast he looked like he might faint. What is this? Lydia asked, sensing the shift in the room. When you applied for the bidder paddle at the auction, I said, my voice level. You needed to show liquidity. You didn't have enough cash. So, you went to a high-risk lender. You took out a second mortgage on the house in Santa Fe. You leveraged 90% of the equity to get that $14.3 million limit. Greg was trembling. He had gambled the family home on a sure thing, and he had lost. That lender, I continued, packages their distressed debt and sells it. My financial team at Ironcrest Capital monitors these packages. When your loan hit the market last week because you missed the first adjustment payment, I bought it. Lydia gasped. She grabbed the paper from Greg's hands. You bought our mortgage? She whispered. I own the debt on the house you sleep in, I said. Technically, I am the bank. Savannah stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. You are going to evict us? Is that it? You brought us here to tell us we are homeless? Sit down, Savannah, I said. It was not a request. She glared at me, but she sat. I am not going to evict you, I said. I have no interest in putting my parents on the street. That is not who I am. I have already instructed my team to restructure the loan. I lowered the interest rate to 2%. Your monthly payments will be half of what they were. Greg let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Elise, thank you. We didn't know how we were going to pay it. But, I said, raising a finger, there are conditions. I leaned forward. That house in Santa Fe, I said. I grew up in it. I know every corner of it. I know what it feels like to be in that kitchen and be told I am not worth the cost of a college application. I know what it feels like to be erased in that living room. I am not going to let that house continue to be a machine that grinds people down, I said. So here is the deal. You can stay. You can live there for the rest of your lives. But if I hear one word, one single report, that you are using that address to play social games, or if I find out you are belittling another human being under that roof, the deal is void. I looked at Savannah. And specifically regarding you, I said, if you ever try to use my name, or this foundation, to sell a product or gain a follower, the equity in that house freezes. I will transfer the value of the mortgage payments directly into the scholarship fund. You will literally be paying for the education of the girls you made fun of. You want to control us, Savannah hissed. You want to be the puppet master. I don't want to control you, I replied. I want to stop you from hurting anyone else. I am giving you a choice. You can live in the house as a family, quietly, without the performance, without the toxicity. You can learn to be happy with what you have, which is more than most people get. I paused. Or, I said, you can sell it. If you cannot stand the idea of living under my terms, you can sell the house. I will waive the penalties. But if you sell, every cent of the profit goes to the Aurora STEM Trust. You walk away with nothing but your pride. The room was silent. The air conditioning hummed. Greg looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at her hands. They realized, finally and totally, that the power dynamic had flipped. They could not charm their way out of this. They could not bully their way out. I held the paper. I held the deed. I held the truth. We can't be on stage at the opening? Greg asked, his voice small. He was still clinging to the last shred of his vanity. No, I said. The stage is for the students. It is not for us. Greg nodded slowly. He looked old. The bluster was gone. Savannah stood up again. She grabbed her purse. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at our parents. She just walked to the door. She couldn't handle it. She couldn't handle a world where she wasn't the center of gravity. I am leaving, she said, and walked out. Greg and Lydia sat there for another moment. Then, slowly, they stood up. They didn't hug me. They didn't try to negotiate. They looked at the map on the wall one last time, at the pins representing the future I was building, and they walked out the door. I sat in the conference room alone. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt light. The invisible cord that had tethered me to their approval for 30 years had finally snapped. I hadn't cut it with anger. I had cut it with boundaries. 3 weeks later, on the morning of the grand opening of the Montclair Summit Academy, I was standing in the atrium. The space was filled with light. 50 students were setting up their projects. There was laughter, the sound of typing, the buzz of collaboration. My phone pinged with an email notification. It was from my lawyer at Ironcrest. Subject: Settlement of Santa Fe Asset. I opened it. Ms. Barnes, your parents have notified us of their decision. They have chosen to sell the property. They stated they prefer to relocate to a smaller apartment in Phoenix rather than accept the terms of the restructured mortgage. Per your instructions, the net proceeds of the sale will be transferred immediately to the Aurora STEM Trust General Fund. I stared at the screen. They chose their pride. They would rather leave the home they had spent decades curating than live in it under a set of rules that required humility. They would rather lose the asset than lose their illusion of control. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was fleeting. It was the sadness you feel when you finish a book that you didn't really like, but you had to finish just to see how it ended. I put the phone in my pocket. Elise? I turned. Maya, the student from Boise, was standing there holding a tablet. She looked nervous but excited. The main presentation starts in 5 minutes, she said. Are you ready? I looked at her. I looked at the sea of bright, intelligent faces around the room. I looked at the mountains beyond the glass, standing tall and immovable. Yes, I said, smiling. I am ready. I walked into the crowd. I didn't look back at the driveway. I didn't look back at the past. The auction was over, the house was full, and the future was waiting. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know which part of the world you are in. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button so more people can hear this story.